The still small voice that God uses to speak to Elijah is probably anything but still and small. Now, we like the idea that God speaks in a still small voice because it means that we don't have to look for some sort of big, flashy, or showy presentation of God in order to hear his voice. And while it may be true that God doesn't always talk with a lot of volume, or he doesn't come and show us huge signs or displays in order to demonstrate what he wants us to do, the reality is that verse isn't really talking about God speaking quietly. In fact, it says the exact opposite. The author of 2 Kings is recreating for Elijah a moment that Israel experienced at that very same mountain, Mount Sinai, many, many years before. And he shows up with fire and smoke and thunder and lightning, and it's this huge dramatic display of his power. And then God speaks, and when God speaks, the people of Israel cover their ears with their hands and scream, "Make him stop, because if we have to listen to his voice, we will die." And so the author of 2 Kings is picking up on that idea. Elijah has run from Israel. He's convinced that God has somehow failed to show up the way that he wanted God to show up. And so he's demanding an audience with God on God's mountain. And so when God does show up, he sends his forerunners ahead. He sends the wind and the thunder and the fire. And God's not in those things because those are announcing his coming. And when he does show up, he shows up with a still, small voice. That's probably not the best rendering of the Hebrew there. The reason that our English Bibles do that is because they're borrowing from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. Those translators didn't really know what to do with those Hebrew words either, and so they rendered them the best they could. But since then, scholarship has demonstrated that the words for still and small probably better mean stilling or stopping, and then shattering or making into small pieces. So this voice that God speaks with after the wind and the fire and the earthquake is a voice that is unmistakable. It is the voice of God that he's already used once before on Sinai. And it is a shattering voice that stops the hearts of anyone who listens. And the whole point of it is that Elijah is convinced that God is somehow weak, that God has somehow failed. And the whole point of God's arrival on the mountain is to demonstrate to Elijah the exact opposite is true. God is still the same powerful God he was when he made his covenant with Israel centuries beforehand. And he will continue to be that powerful God for centuries more. And that's why